Okay, I am re-recording this because, again, there's apparently some kind of sound issue like there was with the postmodern. So if you had trouble with the post-impressionism lecture or the symbolism lecture in terms of hearing the sound on the video recording, try these new re-recorded ones out. I apologize for that. I'm not sure what was going on. Okay, so at this point you should have watched the lecture on Impressionism and the lecture on Post-Impressionism, and now we're going to talk about symbolism. And I know I've said this several times in this class, but although my approach to art history is somewhat chronological in terms of things happening in linear time, one after the other, remember that there's not neat little boxes, okay? So there's a lot of overlap. There's artists who kind of have feet in different movements at different times, and we're just going to see more and more of that as we get further into modernism, as we get into the 20th century. So symbolism is happening kind of congruently with the parts of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, okay? So we have the Impressionists, we have the Post-Impressionists, and they believe that their emotions and sensations were important for interpreting the world around them, particularly the Post-Impressionists, right? Start getting very interested in bringing in ideas about emotion. But what they could see was still their primary focus. Even when we think about, say, Gauguin, who kind of had these discussions with Van Gogh about observation and whether it had merit or not, Gauguin is still an advocate of painting things through the filter of his memory, through the lens of his memory, but it's still things based on the world and in things that he's seen and observing, okay? So, like the realists before them, the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, even though they made some big stylistic changes, and some of them are changing a little bit the focus of the work, they're still based in observation. By the end of the 19th century, many artists and writers were more interested in things they could not see, okay? And so this is where we get into symbolism. The focus in the artistic realms drifts a little bit from the real to the imaginary, okay? From the daily, the everyday kind of things you see with your eyes, to the fantasy. And for us, looking backwards, looking back in time on this doesn't seem that far-fetched, right? We think a lot about artists being really engaged with the imagination, being very creative, and pulling a lot of imaginary, fantastical things out of their minds. This was still sort of a new thing at this time. So remember, we've just seen the advent of photography, which took a lot of the documentarian kind of pressure off of painters and sculptors and other artists. Okay, so we start seeing artists depict forms they conjure in their imaginations, all right? Color, line, and shape are divorced from reality and become tools for expressing personal beliefs and emotions. They also kind of visually speak in signs and symbols, and thus we have symbolism, which becomes developed at this time. The symbolists saw realism as kind of trivial and as kind of unimportant. Like that wasn't really their job. They thought as artists their job was to do something more than or beyond just realism, just representation. And one group of symbolist painters called itself Navis. This is the Hebrew word for prophet. So we get into an area here where there's also some intertwining and some interest in concepts of spirituality. I'm going to do a supplemental kind of bonus lecture about an artist called Hilma af Klint, who is very important in the lineage of abstraction and definitely kind of is in this spiritualist, symbolist kind of movement. And I'm not going to talk about her in this lecture because I'm going to kind of give her her own show. But we have a lot of interesting and new, for the time, points of view coming in. For example, the poet Rimbaud, so R-I-M-B-A-U-D, said artists became beings of extraordinary insight. So a lot of this is also this idea about insight and being able to see beyond the obvious and everything that everybody else sees. Artists also become interested in the dark and irrational human psyche. So the human psyche becomes a big focus as well. We see some hints of this in Van Gogh and also in Gauguin's work in Post-Impressionism, but we really start delving into this in Symbolism. Albert Auer, A-U-R-E-R, was a symbolist poet and critic, and he wrote quite a bit about Gauguin's work, so he's kind of an interesting bridge between ideas from Post-Impressionism and Symbolism. Basically, the interest becomes the reality within the individual and simultaneously beyond the everyday world. So we're looking internally into the inner workings of the human psyche, of individuals, and then also looking at things that exist in this realm sort of beyond what we can see, okay? We'll talk more about psychoanalysis and its relationship to art, which definitely has some influence at this time later, when we talked particularly about surrealism. But that is definitely something that's influential here as well. Sigmund Freud's work, Interpretation of Dreams, is published in the year 1900, and it has a big impact by introducing the concept of the unconscious experiment and experience in our mind. And so this is something that is influential to some of these artists as well. Okay, let's look at some art. So this is Gustave Monet. Gustave Monet is someone that you could look at in a couple of different ways, in a couple of different categories. He's born in 1826 and he dies in 1898. And he is one who, sorry, my allergies are acting up and I have this terrible tickle in my throat. It does not seem to want to go away. So Moreau is one, he studies at École des Beaux-Arts, which is of course the Arts Academy in Paris. A lot of the artists we've been looking at lately study there. And much, much later in his life, he becomes a professor there and teaches artists. But for most of his life, he's very reclusive. It's not the same kind of community as the Impressionists had, where they're all like hanging out together, painting on plein air together. Or Van Gogh and Gauguin sharing a studio and things like this. He's kind of isolated, he's kind of reclusive. He was a big fan of Delacroix, and particularly of Delacroix and other Romantic painters' exotic settings. So this fascination with the Orient, with the other that we see, this kind of exoticizing that we see in Delacroix and some other artists from the Romantic period. Moreau's very interested in that as well. And his subjects are often from mythology or from the Bible, but he emphasizes the world of imagination and of spirituality, okay? So this particular work is called Apparition. In my seated class, I always ask students what an apparition is, and usually someone says it's a ghost or a spirit, which is pretty true. An apparition, you can see it has the same root as appear, something that appears before you. So an apparition is something that kind of appears out of thin air, something that is unexpected, okay? And so this is a painting that he submitted to the Salon of 1876. And its theme is the femme fatale. What is a femme fatale? Well, she's kind of an archetypal character. And basically she's this sort of temptress. She's kind of a destroyer of men in some ways. The example I often use, and there's a new Batman movie out, so this seems appropriate, is kind of a Catwoman figure, okay? So she's kind of, like in an old film noir with a detective, she's this intriguing, kind of sexy, mysterious woman, and maybe she's here to help our protagonist, but sometimes she's deceiving him and leading him awry and da-da-da-da. So she's this kind of intriguing, mysterious character that you can't quite figure out. Is she good? Is she bad? Is she leading us to our doom? Is she, what is she doing? So this idea of the femme fatale is something that Moreau is very interested in, and he returns to this theme again and again in his work. In this particular one, he's combining several of his interests. So here, our femme fatale is Salome. Salome is a biblical character, so she appears in Mark 6:21 through 28. And she's the one who her uncle or stepfather, or maybe her uncle and her stepfather, I can't remember, but anyway, King Herod who's this other kind of notorious biblical figure, wants her to do this dance for him, and he wants her to do this dance of the seven veils. And he says if she does this, she can have whatever she wants. And so she says that she will do this dance, and what she wants is the head of John the Baptist. Not very nice, right? So in this version, we have King Herod sitting in the background on what looks, the background looks sort of like a classic Roman hall that has, it has elements of a classic Roman hall. It also has elements of like kind of a Middle Eastern setting, because this is King Herod from the Bible, so this would be Middle Eastern. So we have King Herod in the back. We also have this figure who's like a guard or something off to the right, who kind of looks like he's maybe dressed in sort of a Middle Eastern garb. We have this woman on the floor who is playing oh gosh, my brain. I'll think of it in a minute. She's playing an instrument that is used in Eastern music. Anyway, it's kind of a mishmash of sort of Byzantine-looking background with some Roman influence. We also have some sort of Arabian Peninsula, some Middle Eastern influence. We also have some sort of Indian looking, like from India looking influence. So it's a kind of a hodgepodge of this exotic background that isn't super well articulated exactly what time period and where we are really, and what culture we're in, okay? And so Salome is in the foreground, and she's very scantily clad. She's wearing golden gems, and she is pointing to this apparition. She's pointing to this this vision, this apparition that appears before her, and it is of the haloed, wide-eyed, blood-dripping head of John the Baptist. So it's kind of graphic and kind of gory, but he still has this holy halo around him, and he's sort of shining in the middle of the hall. So it's this really interesting combination of influences and of styles. And we have this combination of this sort of hallucinatory imagery with this apparition, also the sort of eroticism of this scantily clad young woman. And then we have this weird linear precision of the way some of the figures are portrayed, and we also have this kind of hazy atmospheric feeling to everything. And then we have this opulent setting, and all of this coming together makes this very typical of Moreau's work. So these are all things that he explores in his work throughout his life and his kind of signature style. And this work sort of foreshadows some elements that we see later in surrealism. Okay, let's look at something totally different. I really like this painting. I think this is an extremely lovely painting. And you could tell me that this painting was painted last week, and I would absolutely believe you. I think it's sort of a timeless example of modern painting. Okay, so this is by a guy named Odell Riddle. He's born in 1840 and he dies in 1916. He's super interesting, and he's an artist I wasn't familiar with until much later in my path. He's not someone that I studied when I was an undergraduate taking this class, taking art history too. So he's a super interesting artist. And he wrote about being haunted by imaginary things. So he probably had schizophrenia or some sort of disorder where he actually hallucinated. But you know, this is in 1898, so there wasn't really anything that they knew to do for people with these kind of mental afflictions. He was a great painter. He took technical cues from the Impressionists. He liked the way they applied paint, so he wasn't so much interested in the ideas of how light affects color and capturing that, or in capturing fleeting moments in time, but he liked the application. And some people think that the reason he was so taken with that kind of application of paint is because that was kind of what his world looked like to him because of these hallucinations that he had. So there's some debate about what exactly was going on with him, but he made really fantastic paintings. Some people think he had synesthesia. Synesthesia is a disorder often linked with schizophrenia, but not always, where you your senses get mixed up. So like you can taste color or you can hear color. So when you hear sounds, they present as colors, as colorful hallucinations. So some people think that he may have had synesthesia, which is possible. Okay, he also really liked the colorful palette of the post-impressionists. But he painted very different subject matter from them. He painted these dreamlike narratives and these kind of dreamscapes, okay? So this work is called The Cyclops, and in it he's painting Polyphemus. So Polyphemus, if you've read the Odyssey, that's probably the work he is most famously known from. So in Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus goes on Polyphemus's island where he has his sheep and stuff, and spoiler alert, he eventually blinds him to escape. I mean, it was written 3,000 years ago, so if you haven't read the Odyssey by now, sorry, I've spoiled one little aspect of it. But he's this Cyclops. He's this giant. So in Greek myth, the Cyclops are giants and they have one eye. Okay, so this is Polyphemus, and in the Odyssey, he's portrayed quite differently than how Riddle portrays him now. So we have here Polyphemus kind of shyly peeking out from behind this rock outcropping, and in the Odyssey, this shy, dreamy depiction is very much in stark contrast to how he is in the Odyssey, where he's trying to eat Odysseus. He's a man-eating, monstrous giant that, again, Odysseus blinds and escapes from. But this painting is not of Odysseus, and it's not of the Polyphemus story from the Odyssey. It's from a different story. And this mythological story is a narrative in which Polyphemus is in love, and he's in love with a nymph named Galatea. And so he's kind of like watching her from afar, and so we have this hazy kind of soft focus, kind of lovely thing, and here she exists in this dreamy landscape of color and texture, and he's just kind of watching her. So Redon said of his work, all my originality consists in making unreal creatures live humanly by putting as much as possible the logic of the visible at the service of the invisible. I really like that sentiment. I think that it's very interesting. So he takes these characters, oftentimes from mythology or history, just these kind of known figures, and he tries to take these sort of monstrous kinds of larger-than-life figures and make them more human. And he does this by creating these kind of dreamscapes, these kind of invisible landscapes and settings for them. So there's a lot of speculation about where that fascination comes from for him. And one of the ideas is that because he had these visual hallucinations, whether it was from synesthesia or schizophrenia or whatever, he kind of felt himself a little bit an outcast and kind of outside and a little bit, maybe even a little bit monstrous at times because he was different. And so he had this interest in making portraits of these figures and sort of softening them and portraying them in these different ways. So he's a very interesting artist, and I happen to think he's pretty wonderful. I really love this painting. Okay. Talk about somebody else. Henri Rousseau. So Henri Rousseau is born in 1844 and he dies in 1910. He is a self-taught amateur artist, and sometimes in art history books, Rousseau and other artists who were not apprenticed to masters and did not go to École des Beaux-Arts or other academies, get described as being primitive artists or folk artists, which I understand that the interest is in emphasizing that they are self-taught, but I feel like there's something a little bit derogatory about the way these artists are sometimes talked about in saying, you know, that you have to go to school to be an artist or something, which I don't agree with. I know that's kind of funny since I teach art at a college. That's literally my job, is to teach art and art history classes. But, you know, I don't know, it just seems kind of snobby and not cool. So I don't really agree with that, with calling him a primitive artist. Okay, so he starts painting full time after retiring from a government job. So he had some kind of, I forget exactly what, but he had some kind of sort of bureaucratic government job. And then he decides he wants to get serious about painting and make painting his career. He first exhibited in the Salon of 1885 when he was 41, and critics hated his work. I mean, they really panned it. They did not like it at all. So he exhibited from then on with the Salon des Indépendants from 1886, pretty much every year until his death. And so this was a different salon, a different show of work that was for the independent, so people outside the academy, so doing work that's outside what's mainstream and accepted at the time. Rousseau still, even working with this, exhibiting with this group, received mostly unfavorable responses and criticism of his work. His figures are really interesting, so he's kind of working in a very distinct and kind of his own style. I think his figures are sort of doll-like. Like there's something about them that, this is before animation or anything like that, obviously, but there's something about them that's very constructed and very, like maybe they're made out of ceramics or something. And the settings for these doll-like figures sort of reads like a stage, like stage sets in a theater to me, more so than a natural landscape. And so he develops this very interesting style. He had such a great imagination and such a gift for portraying exotic and unexpected images. I may have I've probably assigned one of you another one of his works called Sleeping Gypsy, which is one of his more famous works. We are going to look at this one, which is very famous as well, and it has a very exotic background. And this is called The Dream. About 25 of his paintings are set in the jungle. Of those, this one's probably my favorite. And this is the last work he completed before his death. It's at the MoMA in New York, the Museum of Modern Art. So if you're in New York at the MoMA, you can see this work in person. The art critic Guillaume Apollinaire said of this work, "This picture radiates beauty. That is undisputable. I believe nobody will laugh this year," because people kind of literally laughed at him at these exhibitions every year. And so this, his final painting, was finally kind of accepted by the critics. It's almost surreal. It's a little bit ahead of its time. And it's a portrait of a woman named Jadwiga, and she was his mistress from when he was very young. The stylized plants are based on his observations at the Paris Museum of Natural History. So this feeling that it has this almost like setting from a play as a background isn't totally incidental, because he was going to the dioramas in the Natural History Museum and sketching them and then using them for his painting. So this is literally the background in a museum setting. So it's kind of interesting. He writes a poem to go with this particular painting, and I'm going to read you the poem. Okay. Jadwiga, in a beautiful dream, having fallen gently to sleep, heard the sounds of a reed instrument played by a well-intentioned snake charmer. As the moon reflected on the rivers or the flowers, the verdant trees, the wild snakes, bend an ear to the joyous tunes of the instrument. Okay. He also wrote a letter to a critic explaining that this is a woman asleep on a couch in Paris dreaming of the jungle, which is kind of interesting. So he would create these sort of fantastical things, but then he wanted people to understand his exact position, so he would write explanations of them. So we have a reference to this kind of classical form of a woman who is nude reclining on a sofa, right? We've seen this odalisque, this kind of look again and again, right? And so that's sort of traditional. And then we have it combined with this very modern idea, which is drawing a subject matter from the unconscious, in this case, the dream of the woman who is asleep on the couch. So he's taking this kind of grounding in a traditional kind of, here's a nude reclining on a sofa, which we've seen many times, and putting it in the setting that comes from the unconscious mind that is very much a modern idea of the time, in keeping with the other symbolists. So he's really doing some pretty incredible, pretty innovative sort of things here. Okay, Edvard Munch. You have heard of Edvard Munch, even if you don't know it. He's most famous for his work that's like The Scream. The Scream is his most famous work. So this is another one of his works. Edvard Munch is born in 1863 and he dies in 1944. Munch is kind of what I would call, I used to always call him kind of an old school emo type, but I feel like the word emo has now gone out of fashion. I've been teaching so long that emo isn't a thing that people understand anymore. People who liked My Chemical Romance and had their bangs in their eyes and lots of dark eyeliner, those kind of people were in high school when I was in college, basically, so it's been a million years ago. Anyway, he's one of these sort of people who felt the pain of existence very deeply. Okay, so whatever your generation calls those people. I feel like they were maybe kind of goths when I was in high school. But anyway, he feels the pain of existence very deeply. And he felt powerless, and he projected that feeling on people, on other people in general, this kind of feeling of helplessness. He felt particularly paralyzed by the forces of love and death, two of the big forces. So love and death were two things that he was particularly felt emotionally fraught about and very kind of paralyzed. And also any emotion associated with that. So like jealousy, loneliness, fear, desire, despair, all of that he was just like overwhelmed by. His most famous painting is The Scream. Its original title was not The Scream. Its original title was Despair. Okay, so this is a theme throughout his work. His goal as an artist, in his words, was to describe the conditions of modern psychic life, which I think puts him pretty squarely in with the symbolists in a lot of ways. So this idea of modernism, we're at the turn of the century, going from the 1800s into the 1900s, made most people feel pretty hopeful and excited, and all these new modern things, all these new technologies, all these new freedoms, all this new kind of stuff was happening. But it also made people a little bit trepidatious and anxious, because change makes people anxious, right? So someone who's already naturally pretty anxious and feels the pain of life deeply, it has a lot of anxiety related to this idea of modernism and this modern mentality, okay? So what he's talking about is the modern psychic life, the way that we are seeing the world and experiencing the world internally. He also had a lot of tragedy in his life. Both his mother and his sister died horribly of tuberculosis, which is a long, drawn-out, very bad kind of death. And this tragedy and witnessing this influenced his life and his work extremely, very much. He's a symbolist, but he's also an expressionist. He's Norwegian, so he's part of the Norwegian expressionists. And he painted several versions of this, of the Madonna. He also produced it as a print. So he did wood cuttings and lithographs also of this image. Some versions, which are nearly identical to this, are alternately titled Loving Madonna. The title Madonna is odd for several reasons. When I ask my students in the seated class who this is, they're unsure. When they see the title, they're kind of more questioning than anything. Oftentimes people kind of point to the halo on her head, but sometimes it's hard to identify that that is a halo because it's red. So it's like, is this blood? Is this some kind of weird hat? Is it a halo? What's happening? So it's a strange title. So Munch was not known as a Christian, nor was he known for painting religious artwork, and this would be quite an unusual way to portray the Virgin Mary, even if he was known for portrayals of religious subject matter. We know his friend Dagny Yule Przybyszywiska, sorry, that's butchered, I do not know how to pronounce her last name, we'll just call her Dagny, was the model. So she modeled for several of his works, and it's believed that he was kind of in love with her, and it was unrequited. Maybe Madonna is a comment about Dagny's beauty and perfection. Perhaps it implies that he worshipped her, that he thought she was someone worthy of worship, like the Madonna. Some critics think the title Madonna is symbolic, using Mary as a stand-in for something that is devotional or worthy of worship. So this is perhaps a devotional painting dedicated not to the Virgin, but to decadent love, or to Dagny herself, maybe, or to the idea of love or unattainable love. Others think she looks kind of demonic. The background, we have this swirling kind of darkness tinged with red, which kind of has this sort of demonic hellscape kind of vibe also. Still others think this is meant to show a woman in the throes of lovemaking, and that this is basically saying the child-making act of intercourse is holy, and kind of focusing on that aspect of passion and love and holiness. She has some things in common with other portrayals of the Virgin Mary. Her eyes are closed. That is often a symbol of modesty. She has long hair. Mary pretty much always has long hair. Some say she is representative of the femme fatale, which again is this kind of trope that we see in Moreau's work and some other symbolist work. Some critics think it is showing a woman as vampiric, like she's a vampire who sucks the energy and life forces out of men. So we have this really strange kind of dichotomy in this image between the perfect, nurturing, beautiful, worshipful Madonna and the haunting, vampiric, lustful femme fatale. So it's this real duality, and a lot of people think it was just partly a portrayal of his views of women in general. He loved women, he worshipped them, but he was also very afraid of them, and he had a lot of ideas about despair, being bound up with love and unrequited love. So it's a very interesting image. One of you is writing about the scream, which again was titled Despair originally. Excuse me. Okay, Gustav Klimt, different kind of artist. So before we get into him, let's talk about another idea that's going around at the time these works are being done, and that is fin de siècle, which is a French term that means end of the century. So we're in this phase, the end of the century, and it isn't just about chronology, the fact that we're about to transition from the 19th century to the 20th century. It's also a certain kind of sensibility of the time. So there's this intense preoccupation at this time with all these modern ideas floating around. Sex drives, powers, perversions, all these kind of ideas related to the inner workings of the inner psyche are coming to light and are becoming an interest. People are very immersed in this idea of the exploration of the conscious and the subconscious mind. There's a determination to enjoy life, but also anxiety about this uncertain future, which we see a lot in transitions between centuries. And when I was younger and we were having the transition between the millennium, when we were coming into the year 2000, that anxiety was even more. People were totally freaked out. So this is just sort of a thing that we have with the human condition, which is weird because we made up these numbers. We're the ones who made up the years, so it's sort of arbitrary. So it's a funny thing, I think, to be so focused on. Okay, anyway, Gustav Klimt, he's born in 1863. He dies in 1918. And he captured this fin de siècle flamboyance in his work, but he tempered it with some sort of unsettling undertones. This is his most famous work. He's from Vienna, which is in Austria. And this is called The Kiss. And it shows this couple that's kneeling and they're embracing. The setting here is very interesting because it's abstracted, so we're not grounded in a certain time or place. So it's kind of this timeless sort of floating in space that's nowhere but also could be anywhere. We only see a small part of the couple's bodies. They're mostly covered in these kind of patterned clothing. We don't see the man's face at all. The rest is just sort of dissolved into this shimmering gold background. This one's done in what's called his golden period because he used a lot of gold palette at this time, and also literal gold. There's a lot of gilding, a lot of gold leaf in here. The woman is probably Klimt's companion, Emilie Floge, but that is not recorded anywhere. Some say the man is Klimt and that this is a portrait of them together. It's oil and gold leaf on canvas. The patterning here has ties both to the arts and crafts movement and Art Nouveau, which were happening at the time and were mostly movements to do with design and architecture. But it's also used to signify gender contrast, okay? So the man has all these rectangles in his clothing, the woman has all these circles, so he's very geometric and stiff and rectilinear, and she's very curvaceous and round and flowy. The patterning, the all-over patterning also flattens and abstracts the figures, okay, and further pushes them into this background, further dissolves them and flattens them into this background. Even though their garments have distinct patterns and shapes, they're also united into one form by the patterning and the fact that they're just sort of this homogeneous patterned sort of glob. It's also interesting because the only attempt at modeling, at showing three-dimensionality, is done on the actual little bits of their flesh that we can see, her face, his neck, her foot, her arm, his hands. And so it's kind of like the people are still grounded in reality, but all this that's happening is maybe what's going on inside their minds. Their eyes are closed. Maybe we're inside this fantastical mindscape. Okay. Gertrude Casabile, pardon me, is born in 1852 and dies in 1934. She's actually an American. One of you is writing about Blessed art thou among women in the discussion post. One of you is researching that piece by this artist, which has more clear ties to symbolism, given the sense of spiritual and divine involved in the work. Casabile is one of the early photographers to see the expressive potential in this new medium, so she uses photography in a different kind of way than a lot of other photographers at the time. Instead of just using it to document, she's also exploiting light and the use of light to create, and the use of focus and soft focus to create spiritual and emotional content. We call this movement the pictorial style in photography, and Casabile is one of the leading practitioners. She was a painter first, but became famous for her symbolist themes in photography, and I think that that's partly evident in her work, that she had this sort of painterly eye and painterly sensibilities and then moved into photography. She utilized soft focus as an expressive quality to capture the sense of the spiritual and the divine in kind of everyday life. This particular work is a little bit more straightforward of a piece. She also did portraiture, but she tended to like to do portraits of people not like in front of a black backdrop, really, really posed, but a little bit more in their own setting. So this is a portrait of Auguste Rodin, and he is in his studio. It's taken in 1905. I chose that piece as a transition into sculpture because we're going to talk about Auguste Rodin now. He's born in 1840 and dies in 1917, and he was the leading French sculptor of this time. And he's one of the most famous sculptors of any time. If you don't think you're familiar with his work, you probably are at least familiar with The Thinker, just that kind of posed sculpture like that. It's very, very famous. He was interested in portraying the body realistically, but his subject matter often had a conceptual edge. He was influenced by the Impressionists, which is kind of interesting for a sculptor, and their work with light. He was fascinated with how light on the surface of a sculpture could affect the perception, and although he liked to make things fairly realistic, he manipulated his surfaces so that they would reflect light in certain ways to make his work appear and be perceived differently. He famously said, "The sculptor must learn to reproduce the surface, which means all that vibrates on the surface: soul, love, passion, life. Sculpture is thus the art of hollows and mounds, not of smoothness or even polished plains." So he didn't think that everything had to be perfectly finished and made really, really smooth, because he actually thought these mounds and hollows, as he called them, the textures that interacted with light in different ways, were more interesting and in some cases more important to work in sculpture. This is called the Gates of Hell. Excuse me, I apologize. And this took him 20 years to finish. So it's a pretty major work. It was very, very ambitious. And this was a major government commission. So the French government commissioned this project to be the entryway for the Museum of Decorative Arts. Sadly, the museum was never built. But we do have the doors, and they're pretty incredible to look at. They're very startling in person. The commission allowed him to choose his own subject, and he chose the Gates of Hell based on Dante's Inferno and Baudelaire's Flower of Evil. So he was very interested in capturing the essence of these kind of written works in a visual way, in a sculptural way. He was also inspired by Ghiberti's Gates of Paradise, which he had seen in Florence when he had traveled to Florence. We talked about them in this class before. So the Gates of Paradise are Ghiberti, so he wants to respond and make the Gates of Hell. He covered the doors in a continuing writhing mass, which is in contrast to Ghiberti's neat squares that each depict a different scene from the Old Testament, if you recall. He wanted something that really flowed and turned into each other, that had more of a feeling of chaos, not this feeling of order, right? Because of the varying depth of the relief, because some of these are almost in the round, they come so far out, the effect of light on these highly textured surfaces and the complex poses, the figures seem to kind of move in and out of an undefined space. They're in psychic turmoil, and when you walk up to this thing and walk side to side, the way the light plays on it and the way they're arranged, it does sort of feel like they're moving with you. It's a really kind of an eerie effect that it has. There are around 200 figures, so that's a ton of work. You can understand why this took him 20 years. And another little fun kind of detail is there's a small version of his famous sculpture, The Thinker, in this famous pose here. You can see it's up at the top. And in it, he's representing Dante contemplating the tortured souls below. Okay, lastly, we're going to talk about Camille Claudel. She's born in 1864 and dies in 1943. She meets Rodin in 1883 when she was an apprentice to a different sculptor. And she becomes his assistant. She becomes Rodin's assistant, model, and lover. And she rivals him in her artistic skill. She's a very accomplished sculptor as well. She made large works for public commissions, but she specialized in small bronze works for private homes. One of you is writing about the Waltz, which is her most famous work. It's an incredibly stirring, beautiful sculpture. Here's her work, Clotho, and this one is super interesting. It's exhibited at the Paris Salon in 1893, and it's inspired by classical mythology. So if you've ever read any mythology or studied mythology at all, there's the three fates. Okay, so there are these three sisters, and they spin the threads of everyone's life. And like if a hero or someone's going to die, they cut the thread. So there are these three fates who control everyone's life, basically. And so Clotho is one of them, and one of them who's deciding human destiny. Here she's shown as a very elderly woman, and she's interested in the sculptural depiction of old age. So Claudel is very interested in Verism. So if you took Art History 1 with me, we talk about Verism both in the early Roman Republic and in the Flavian period later in the High Empire. So it's an interest in showing things not forever young and youthful and godlike, but showing the wrinkles, showing receding hairlines, showing sagging, showing all these things that happen to bodies as they age as kind of a triumphant sign of wisdom. So Claudel is very interested in depicting old age, and part of this preoccupation is that she starts off her career as sort of this model muse type figure for these sculptors, and becomes a sculptor herself and becomes quite accomplished. But she's also a woman, and as she's aging, there's all these weird gender things about aging women, and she becomes very interested in this idea. Okay, she also has a preoccupation with destiny. She's very interested in ideas about destiny and things being predetermined, which is kind of a symbolist thing too. So the Fates, Clotho and her sisters, spun the thread of human life, and here Clotho seems to be sort of caught in her own trap. Her hair is weighed down, with the volume of all the thread that she spins, and it's pulling at her, and she's sort of twisted up in her own hair, and it's like her her obsession with other people's destiny and her control of destiny has sort of consumed her, and she looks sort of tormented and overwhelmed. So very interesting sculpture of the time. Camille Claudel is a super interesting figure from this time period. And that's kind of symbolism. There's a lot of different people in symbolism and different aspects of it, particularly spiritualism, which I'll talk about more in a bonus lecture I will soon record about Helma F. Klimt. All right, next time we will talk about Fauvism and German Expressionism.